the war created political momentum in the North that really was in favor of ending slavery. Keep in mind, before Lincoln was president, he pledged to protect slavery where it existed, but he wanted to prevent further expansion. He did feel that slavery was morally wrong, but he also felt that the Constitution gave the federal government absolutely no power to abolish slavery in the states. Um, he did not believe that blacks and whites were equal in most ways, but he did believe that they had equal claims to economic and basic human rights. He also knew that very many people did not agree with him. Um, a representative democracy of white men, their views really did matter, and he looked at it that they did elect him. So his moral views were constrained by democracy, in his opinion. But the war changed his thinking in three fundamental ways. Um, all these things that pushed him to become less focused on loyal slaveholders, such as those in the border states. Now, keep in mind, Kentucky did not secede. But Lincoln really has to look at Kentucky and Maryland and those areas that that kind of prove as almost a buffer zone. But it did change his thinking. One of those ways was as commander in chief in wartime, he possessed the constitutional authority to undertake otherwise unconstitutional actions, and that was particularly the case in regard to military necessity. Also, his strategy to end disunion and win the war determined how he exercised his powers as that commander in chief. And so all of a sudden, this feeling that ending slavery as a way to end the war started becoming more and more important to him. And remember, he had thought that there were enough loyal Unionists in the South to create an insurrection from within. And so he starts looking at this as, okay, that didn't work. There's not been an internal rebellion in the South that has put this to an end. Now, could the Union look at slaves themselves as creating an insurrection from within the South? So Lincoln, the third way was Lincoln. Lincoln was pushed toward maintaining support for the war, especially among Republicans, and the majority of the Republicans in the North were looking at slavery as being bad, and so therefore, in the South, concentration shifted away from loyal Unionists toward the slaves. So let's look at this, how this looked on the ground. So there was the First Confiscation Act of 1861. And this provided that any slaves who worked to support the Confederate military war effort could be seized from their master. Okay, so this idea of contraband was confiscated property. And so originally, if a slave escaped to the Union line and belonged to a loyal Unionist, that slave had to be returned to his or her owner. Basically, it turned Union soldiers into slave catchers. So this First Confiscation Act kind of turned them into slave catchers. So Congress adopted an article of war on March 13th that prohibited any Union soldier or sailor from returning fugitive slaves to their masters. Slave owners who claimed to be loyal could still come within Union lines to retrieve their slaves, but military personnel were forbidden to aid them. So April 10th, Congress adopted Lincoln's plan for gradual compensated emancipation. Now, what this means is, okay, if you look at the South and you say, okay, most Southern landowners' money was wrapped up in their slaves. If you ask them, produce me X amount of dollars, they may not actually have that physical money. What they did have were slaves that represented that money. So as where we have a paper money or a debit card or something like that that represents that money, all their money in the South was tied up in slavery. So Lincoln did know that if you immediately end slavery, then it basically collapses the economy of the United States. Now, keeping in mind, Lincoln never did recognize the South as being seceded from the Union. Lincoln consistently viewed himself as the president of both the Union and the Confederacy. He did not recognize that Confederacy. On April 10th, Congress adopted his plan with this idea of compensated emancipation. So on April 16th, Congress took the lead and abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. And what they did was they were going to provide funds to compensate slave owners for these slaves that were being freed, so they would not lose whatever financial investment was wrapped up into that slave. What they planned to do with this plan was to actually send those newly freed slaves someplace outside of the United States and colonize an area just for those people. Lincoln felt that he actually felt bad about this and said it should have been for gradual emancipation. That now families would at once be deprived of cooks, stable boys, and by they, he's talking about their former slaves, of their protectors without any provisions for them. So, because they went ahead and emancipated, it kind of turned some things upside down. Those people who had depended on those slaves didn't have the workers anymore. He also looked at it as those slaves who had, I guess, been protected by the families that they worked for. Now they're put out on the streets with no work, no way to provide for themselves or their families. At times, commanders on the ground in the South did free slaves occasionally. General David Hunter declared that tens of thousands of slaves in his region were freed out of military necessity. He didn't even consult the president about this. The problem is to do a gradual compensated emancipation on a whole that would include the South. The federal government just simply couldn't afford to compensate all those slaveholders. So emancipation did not actually happen until January 1st of 1863. By 1862, Lincoln resolved privately to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, but in public, he continued to state that his goals were to save the Union without necessarily doing anything about slavery. So what he did was he presented Congress a detailed proposal for the form of gradual compensated emancipation that he preferred. Federal government can't do it. And it was designed to eliminate slavery eventually. However, those who were loyal to the Union would not lose everything. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed this very carefully crafted Emancipation Proclamation. And you're going to look at that proclamation this week. And there's things that, honestly, if you don't put down there, it's going to trigger me as to whether you've done the reading and whether you've listened to these lectures, because that Emancipation Proclamation did not emancipate slaves in areas under Union control. So Kentucky, it did not emancipate the slaves in Kentucky, in particular. So because the conventional constitution restraints were completely enforced in those areas. But if you look at the South, those constitutional constraints did not affect them because they had seceded. Lincoln emancipated the slaves in the rebel states only, where he claimed constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, but he did not emancipate the slaves in the regions where he lacked that constitutional authority. So basically what Lincoln did was, if you look at the Confederacy as being separate from the United States at this point, Lincoln issued a proclamation to free the slaves in a region where he did not have any constitutional authority, where basically he didn't have any authority at all. But once the South falls, that still all kind of ties in. But so as you're writing that document analysis, really pay attention to the language in the Emancipation Proclamation and what he's doing. The tide shifted for the Civil War, really, 1863, 1865. If we look at Vicksburg was so bad that the civilians were actually forced into caves to escape the bombardment there. They apparently they ate mules and rats to survive during this. This took like 6 weeks. The Confederates surrendered unconditionally. By the time we see Gettysburg, it is very similar to that situation that I talked about in the last video about Fredericksburg. Remember, I talked about that height advantage for being able to see. Very similar thing happens at Gettysburg, except this time the Union had the better position. It was a 3-day battle. Lee lost more than a third of his army because they kept trying to run across that open field, because at Vicksburg, he took the wrong lesson, right? He took that lesson that he had the superior army, when in fact it was a geographical advantage that he had there. That was very much a Union victory. Between the two battles at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the problem becomes is the Confederacy simply cannot replace the 60,000 soldiers that they lost between those two battles. Grant really takes control of the army here. He has 2 strategic moves that he really wanted to use. One of those was to start that anaconda squeezing, and he does this with a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, and he was appointed by Grant over the Western armies. What he did was he plunged southeast toward Atlanta, and he marched out of Atlanta with 62,000 veterans to Savannah. He said, "We destroyed all we could not eat." So not only strangling them out in the form of marching across there, but also setting their homes on fire, eating all the food that they had in the fields. Sherman's march to the sea aimed at breaking the will of the Southern people and destroying all their provisions. When Sherman took Savannah, he telegraphed the president that he had a Christmas gift for him, and that was a quote, was a Christmas gift for him. So Grant went head-to-head with Lee in Virginia for 4 straight weeks at the Battle of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. This was a lot of hand-to-hand fighting for 18 hours in the rain. It was said that they piled upon each other in some places 4 layers deep, exhibiting every ghastly phase of mutilation. Grant had 18,000 casualties, whereas Lee had 10,000. Now, that sounds like the Union had a lot more casualties. The problem, though, again, that the South is going to have here is they don't have the people that they can just keep throwing in there, whereas the North does. Grant very much looks at this and says, I've got the people. As much as you hate to look at it this way, they can, almost like they're maybe a little bit disposable, because he does have that force there that he can keep pushing. At Cold Harbor, they tangled with Lee again, 13,000 Union, 5,000 Confederates. Congress, and one of the reasons that Grant can replace his people is that Congress had passed the nation's first draft law on March 3rd, 1863. Each congressional district was required to supply a certain number of recruits based on its population, and they based that population of men between the ages of 20 and 40 years old. And a lot of times they gave rewards to men who volunteered. And Grant absolutely knew that the South could not do this. By the time the war ends, Abraham Lincoln was reelected in 1864. Sherman and Grant had stripped the South of their provisions. Grant pursued Lee until he surrendered on April 9th of 1865. Grant actually allowed Lee's men to return home and keep their horses. The Confederacy collapsed within 2 weeks after Lee was gone, and Lincoln was relieved, and he told his cabinet that his post-war burdens would weigh almost as heavy as those of wartime.